Good morning, St. John's, and welcome to our fifth Sunday in Lent. Our talk this morning is about the cathedral itself, our Cathedral of St. John's in Jacksonville. It's a wonderful building, and I know we all appreciate it, and I know we all can't wait to get back inside and live it to its fullest after the pandemic is over. The end is in sight, so that is a good thing, I believe. But until then, I'd like to talk about the architecture itself, which we use, which we experience when we're in the cathedral, but which we may have many questions about. It is a historic architecture, and it's one that requires a certain amount of knowledge of the past, the knowledge of the history of architecture and of art to understand. And the church is a highly evolved form of architecture. The earliest churches, of course, were simple house churches in the earliest Christian era. And today, when we talk about the church as we know it, we're talking about the evolution of 2,000 years of architectural function and purpose through many changes in style and taste and design, which have adapted the church into its modern form for us. Now, our church is, in fact, an example of a revival style architecture. As almost everyone will recognize simply by looking at it, it is a very medieval looking building and does not reflect a modern American colonial architectural sensibility. It is an architecture that harkens back to the late Middle Ages, to the 15th and 16th century in England. It's a type of late medieval English Gothic architecture that we know as Tudor. Now, the Tudor monarchs are the monarchs of the late 15th century and 16th century in England, most famously, perhaps Elizabeth, who was a Tudor monarch, and of course Henry, the King of England, who broke with Rome, broke with the Roman Church, and established the Anglican Communion, the Anglican Church, under his authority in the 16th century. It is appropriate, thus, that our church is built in a Tudor style, since it is the style that existed in England at the time that the Anglican Communion came into being. The Tudor Gothic style has many Gothic features which are consistent with the earlier styles, although it imports certain changes as well. We can see here these wonderful Gothic pinnacles, which are flanking either side of the facade of our Telfair Hall. And the gabled buttresses, these are also starkly peaked gables, which are characteristic of the Gothic style. The elaborate window tracery that decorates our windows is also characteristic of the Gothic, and as well the stonework above the doorways. Pointed arches are characteristic of Gothic art. These pointed arches, which we find throughout our building, are a characteristic design feature of Gothic architecture. These are particularly Tudor arches, which, in contrast to traditional Gothic arches, have a more depressed or a lower point or peak. Our building, thus, is a very historic and very traditional building. And as you can see here, as we look at it from the church side, has a number of features which really stand out in the landscape of urban Jacksonville. Our building was built in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, after the Great Fire of Jacksonville in 1901. It was built at a time in America when American architects and architecture were looking back to the past during a period of urban development and city beautification that we know as the City Beautiful movement. And a number of our most gorgeous buildings downtown were built at the same time, of course, in the wake of the fire. It just happened that our fire came at a moment in American history when cities across the country were thinking very deeply about the civic importance of beautiful buildings and of beautiful urban spaces. It's in the early 20th century that we find not only the rebuilding of Jacksonville in the wake of the fire, many of the great buildings that resulted from that wave of architectural renewal, but we also find the first city parks and many of the amenities that we consider to be characteristic and essential to civic life in urban cities today. Our building was thus built not only to renew downtown Jacksonville in the wake of the fire, but also to embody these ideals of a democratic, a wealthy democratic society that cares for the well-being of its citizens and for the daily lives of its citizens in a beautifully built, a well-constructed, and a vital city with a dynamic urban core. That's a beautiful ideal that we should cherish and we should think about today in the context of the city in which we live today. Our urban civic debates are ongoing and long running in the city of Jacksonville, and our cathedral as an anchor in downtown space, an anchor of beautiful, harmonious, and historic architectural reflection on the past, is a part of that conversation in ways that are essential to the future of our city. I think that's one of the great responsibilities, and it's also one of the great privileges of the congregation and the cathedral at St. John's, to be a part of that conversation and to be leaders in the conversation about the importance of beautiful space, of access to beauty, of beauty as a civic right and a civic virtue. We do indeed have a beautiful building. It is constructed of stone imported from Indiana granite. It is just an exquisitely well designed and luxurious building built in the Tudor style. We can see on the exterior these beautiful stepped buttresses and the window tracery, which shows so beautifully from the street. We know that the glory of the stained glass is really experienced on the inside of the building, but Gothic windows were built to be appealing architecturally from the exterior as well. From the west end, we can see the west front of our cathedral building, which of course was not built as a cathedral, but as a parish church. And in its proportions, it embodies the traditional dimensions and the architectural aspect of a parish church rather than as of a more lofty Gothic cathedral. It's low to the ground. It is simply built. It has a single nave aisle. It is although an architecturally elaborate building for our landscape, it is a humble building in its proportions and in its scale. From the west, we can see the main central entryway and the rose window in the west wall, the outline of the buttresses, which support the building and also perform an important decorative function. And of course, the tower, not on the west, but the tower, which is one of the most dynamic and striking features of the cathedral, crowned by the Eagle of St. John's and a pair of dragon gargoyles, which are really quite wonderful and are also symbols of St. John, I believe, as we'll see as we progress in our talk. Just for comparison's sake, this is an actual small Tudor church here in Suffolk, in England, which I think exemplifies some of the same features of our church. These Tudor style depressed arch windows with a single nave aisle, the tower here located on the west with its crenellated fortress-like top, characteristic of Tudor architecture, and a south entryway, much like our church has off of the west end of the church. The humble proportions of this building, which is just a regional English parish church, are much smaller than our church, which was built, I think, on a grander scale, both to embody the ambitions of the city of Jacksonville and of its most important Episcopal and oldest Episcopal foundation. The interior of our church is, I think, really the most splendid part of the building. It is a classic example of Tudor Gothic hammer beam construction. Hammer beam vaults, which we see here, are wood vaults, carpentered vaults, which are considered to be the highest achievement of the English Gothic carpenters. They're a really beautiful, exquisite design, very intricate in construction, that allow what would otherwise be a simple timber truss roof to take on a decorative aspect, which is really as vibrant and beautiful as any stone vaulted building of the sort that we find in the earlier Middle Ages. Hammer beams have a very interesting and complicated architectural structure The hammer beam itself is this longitudinal beam, which receives the weight of the rafter from the roof above it. Hammer beams have a complex structure with these hammer beams, as they're called, the hammer braces, which spring from the wall on the sides and support the hammer beam in the manner of an arch. Then here we have the arch beams themselves, known as collar braces, and the rafters, which descend from the ceiling and support the roof. The result is this open trusswork design of really exceptional beauty and architectural sophistication. Here we are looking into the apse of the church, and like almost all English Gothic churches, our apse has a flat wall rather than a rounded semicircular wall, as we often find in continental architecture. English Gothic architecture from its earliest days had square walls rather than rounded walls in the apse. And here we see a side view down the nave aisle of our church into the apse with that wonderful, beautiful open trusswork hammer beam construction, and our windows, the Tudor windows, which are built in the perpendicular style, which is the last phase of English Gothic decorative style. Perpendicular here refers to the orientation geometrically of the window tracery panes. Everything is organized along XY axes and perpendicular lines, in contrast to the more decorative style of the earlier Gothic period, which is known as the decorative style. Our windows are all built in the Tudor perpendicular style in the cathedral. And like stained glass windows everywhere in churches across the continent and in England, the windows capture a history of the church, both a history of its theological ideas, a history of its parish. As we can see, many of our windows, most of them, bear dedications to the donors from the congregation whose donations to the church made the construction of these windows possible. But the windows also record the history of our church and our diocese in another way. Here we are looking at the stained glass panes, which depict the bishops of the Diocese of Florida, including Edwin Weed, who was the first bishop of the Diocese of Florida and an important figure in our church here at Jacksonville. The outside of our building bears a dedication stone, which records the complex history of the site. The first St. John's Church was built in 1842 here on Billy Goat Hill, the highest point of land in the city of Jacksonville. That church burned in 1862, and there begins an important story about our church, but also about churches everywhere. Churches are built, in some sense, for eternity. And once a consecration is bestowed on a church site, that consecration lives in the manner of a soul eternally within the walls of the church, and even if they're burned on the site of the consecrated ground on which it stands. And the burning of churches is, of course, a natural and a human disaster, which is almost inevitable. And there are many stories of famous and important cathedrals which have burned and been rebuilt and burned and been rebuilt. The investment in the reconstruction of them is an investment in the faith of our communities and in our sense of continuity with the past, our cherishing of that memory of the consecration of the original church. It's an act of piety, it's an act of civic investment, and it's an act of urban renewal all at the same time. So the church was rebuilt in 1873, and then, of course, that church burned as well in the Great Fire of Jacksonville, which consumed so much of downtown. The rebuilding was commenced in 1902. We can see in the wake of the fire of Jacksonville, the devastation of downtown here at the frontier between the burned part of downtown and the line where the city began to be saved. The tent cities that arose here in central downtown, and the absolute devastation that we found most of the city in the wake of its burning. And we can see here the that second church building erected in 1873, the ruins and remains on this site of our current cathedral, this church was built of brick and granite, but you can see it was absolutely devastated by the fire. That history is recorded in stained glass windows as well. In the south entryway of the cathedral, we find these windows facing each other, quite striking and beautiful. Some of the latest stained glass windows in the church. They record the history of our congregation and the history of the Episcopal Church in the city of Jacksonville. On the left, we see the image of John Hawkins, an English naval captain and trader who is regarded as the first person to celebrate Anglican services in North America, when in 1565, he entered the St. John's River near Fort Caroline, the French colony, the French Huguenot settlement, and celebrated services, we believe, on the deck of his ship. He came to Fort Caroline to get fresh water for his journey back to England after making a voyage. But he traded also with the settlers at Fort Caroline and gave them essential supplies. They were running low on supplies, and in fact, they shortly abandoned the settlement at Fort Caroline. And it was John Hawkins' intervention that made it possible for them to close up shop and to leave. So we see in the background of this image the grateful Protestant Huguenot settlers of Fort Caroline, who are bidding farewell to John Hawkins, who not only refueled them with supplies, but also gave them the smallest of his ships, which enabled them and assisted them to leave the site. John Hawkins has an open book here and is celebrating the services of the church, but is also pointing here in a prophetic manner toward the burning building of that 1873 church destroyed by fire, out of which rises phoenix-like, a bird, which we may think of as a phoenix, but we may also think of as the eagle of St. John's, since the eagle itself was a symbol of resurrection and renewal in the Middle Ages. People believed in the Middle Ages that eagles did not die, but rather grew old. And when they grew old, they flew into the sun, which burned off their feathers and scorched the cataracts from their eyes, and at which point they plunged into the ocean to cool off and emerged again, new, very much like the story of the phoenix. We see then above the image of the restored and rebuilt St. John's Cathedral with emblems of St. John's above. In fact, this chalice with the dragon in it is a fascinating symbol of St. John himself. As we see here in a similar painting, this refers to a legend or a story that St. John was ordered by a pagan priest to drink from a poisoned chalice. The priest tempted him. He said, if you believe so much in your God, if you have so much faith in your God, then ask him to protect you from this poisoned cup. And the priest presented to him a poisoned cup of wine. If you believe, he says to St. John, that your God will protect you if you have faith in him, then drink this cup. John takes the cup and waves his hand over it, and the poison turns into a serpent and slithers out of the glass, leaving the wine safe to drink. The serpent is sometimes represented as here, like a dragon. And we find a similar image from a Tudor era church in Cambridge, a stained glass window from the early 16th century, around the same moment that King Henry broke from the Roman Church. There, rising up out of the chalice, is the dragon or the serpent of poison that is associated with St. John's. In the opposite window, we see an image that depicts a grapevine growing out of a rock surrounded by turbulent waves and waters. Grapevine is a symbol of course, the Eucharist, the wine of the Eucharist. It is also a symbol of renewal and of resurrection. There is nothing that looks more dead in the winter than a pruned grapevine. And there's nothing more verdant and alive and fruitful than a grapevine in summer. And that cycle of renewal is an essential symbol of the renewal of the church. Rising out of this rock, we see the eagle of St. John's representing our church. And here, the lily of St. Mary's, another early congregation in Episcopal congregation in Jacksonville. And here we see the symbols of St. Stephen's, the three stones which Stephen, the first martyr, was martyred. We see here an image of St. Stephen with the same three stones here clustering around his shoulders and his head, referring to another congregation in Jacksonville. St. Andrew's, meanwhile, here with his St. Andrew's cross, what we know as the Saltire or St. Andrew's cross, which refers to the fact that Andrew was martyred by being crucified on an X-shaped cross, as well as the fish, which refer to Andrew as the fisher of men. Here, the image of the Gospeler of St. Mark, the lion being his symbol, representing the congregation of St. Mark's. So rising out of this fruitful vine in the soil of Jacksonville, we find the full image of our Episcopal community, growing like clusters of grapes on the vine. In the center, we see the Chi-Rho, the monogram of Christ himself, and descending from the heavens, the dove of the Holy Spirit. Windows that record the history of Jacksonville in an architecture which is itself historic and connects us across time to the past, to the origins of our Anglican communion, to the origins of the church, and even more distantly in past, to the origins architecturally of the church itself. So thank you very much for joining us this week. I will see you all again after Easter. Take care.